who's coming to us live from the UK. Philip Sawyers has been composing since the age of 13 and is going strong. And this morning they're going to be talking to us about his music and the relevance of the symphony. 300 years old. Is the symphony still relevant? Without any further ado. Actually, one more thing. We have some great Mahlerfest souvenir memorabilia items, DVDs, CDs. We also have the highly coveted Mahlerfest socks. I recommend buy 2 pair because the family always takes one of your socks, okay? Anyways, if you would like to purchase something, just let us know and we'll take care of you. Without further ado, Ken?
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear us okay? Sorry for the delay. Technology is both a friend and an enemy, as I'm sure you all know. It is for the premiere of his symphony tonight, but it's another casualty of the frustrating times in which we live that non-American citizens are currently not being let into the country. So he comes to us via Zoom, and let's say good morning to Philip, please.
Good morning. Morning, everybody. I'm sorry that I can't be with you. I'd love to be there, obviously.
So, Philip, why don't we start by the most recent developments, the Fifth Symphony, and how it came to be. When did you start working on the piece, and what was the impetus for it?
I've actually had a look in, I don't know if you can see this. This probably won't look very much like anything, but I bet you know what that is, Ken.
I certainly do.
Notice it says Pembrokeshire, Wales, Bryn Cottage, August the 19th, and they're the first dates for the Fifth Symphony. And the first thing happened with a viola melody, which actually does open the symphony. So that's kind of follow the genesis of the whole piece through these pages and pages. It got interrupted at one point with the double concerto, the concerto for violin and cello for Maya and Daniel, and then it got restarted again. But of course, it was all through lockdown, so it's a very kind of strange feeling. We kind of almost enjoyed our lockdown here, my partner and I in London, because we got a rather nice large house and a large garden. And we're not always terribly sociable either, so it kind of suited. But I hope not too much of that, well, none of that will come out. Fascinating question, how much of that is affecting what a composer does? Prime example, you think of Vaughan Williams' Fifth Symphony. Written during the Second World War, everybody was expecting something explosive like his Fourth Symphony. And you've got this wonderful, calm, beautiful, pastoral, uplifting symphony in the midst of turmoil. And I suppose it's a fantastic kind of image.
That's very well said, and it's you're not the first composer I've talked to recently who's said that actually lockdown is not a bad situation for a composer to be in a way. And just for our guests, tell us about the totality of what you've composed since everything went a little crazy last year.
So there was the. Sorry, did you say the totality?
Yes, all the pieces that we've had.
Yeah. So there was the symphony. There was a string orchestra piece that was commissioned by somebody who'd sadly lost both his parents. Actually, a music critic, so it was rather kind of nice to be asked to write something by a music critic who are traditionally supposed to be composers' enemies.
Is he going to write a scathing review of it?
Then there was a viola concerto that I was in the process of finishing, a piano quartet, this double concerto, and also the start of the Sixth Symphony. But I still managed to find time to sort of lays about and goes cycling along the River Thames near my home here. So I think that's still quite a lot, isn't it?
It is. It's humbling, actually, for those of us who had grand ambitions at the beginning of this that have largely gone unfulfilled. This is your first 5-movement symphony. Was that something that evolved as you worked with the material, or was it a form that you were curious to work with in the past?
Well, one of my very earliest pieces I wrote when I was a student of symphonic music for strings and brass is in 5 sections, but unlike this, it was in the sort of Bartok mirror form. So once you got to the middle, the 4th and 5th sections were mirrors and developments of the 1st and 2nd. But this is kind of a different shape. I think it's because I wanted to make the slow movement and the finale really kind of quite large movements. And so it just seemed really kind of logical to frame, or not logical, that makes it sound sort of ridiculously intellectual and thought about, but it just seemed like to frame them with 2 rather short and fairly fast scherzo movements either side. So that was the kind of shape that kind of appeared in my mind. Almost before I started working, actually.
The overall shape of the work, while smaller in scale, is very similar to both Mahler's 7th and 10th symphonies. Where you've got 1, 3, and 5 are sort of the key focal points, and then 2 and 4 have their own interconnections. Was that in any way in your mind?
Probably not consciously, but because, like you, I've lived with these works for a long time. How do we know what's influenced us unconsciously to give us these choices? I also think, the wonderful opening of Mahler 10 with the violas, and also the opening of the Bartok music for strings, percussion, again with violas. Somehow that was really upwards in my mind, when I first started the piece, which, I mean, you've had the luxury of hearing it, I haven't yet, so you'll know more about it than me. And it sort of reminds me of that wonderful thing that the conductor, George Schulte, always referred to the viola section in the Royal Opera House Orchestra Covent Garden as the mourners, because of the sound that they made. And I suppose if you think of the opening of Mahler 10 and also the Bartok and possibly this piece of mine, there is a kind of rather somber, mournful approach. Although all the continual pizzicatos in the bass and cellos give it a kind of march-like feeling, almost a kind of feeling, a hope of inevitability.
Yeah, we've used the word inexorable in rehearsals for that movement, that it just needs to sort of roll along as something that waits for no one but proceeds at a relatively steady pace. And for me, it's certainly the atmosphere of that opening also kind of reminds me a little bit of Bruckner 5, that the pizzicato walking bass line and the long melody and sort of contrapuntal flowering of it all. The first movement is in some ways the darkest bit of the piece, and that seems to be something that appears in quite a few of your works. It's both the 3rd and 4th symphonies also have very dark, stormy first movements. Again, is this sort of by design, or is it the result of how the material develops over the course of the piece?
It might also be sort of to do with how I am as a person, because the first thing in the morning I'm pretty miserable, so to be slightly less flippant, I think this kind of idea of journeying from somewhere, perhaps from a point of stress or insecurity to a point of optimism and happiness and finality, is something I've always enjoyed in all the great symphonies that end in that kind of optimistic way. And I mean, of course, Mahler 5.
Mhm.
What a fantastic, such an exhilarating finish to it. But my goodness, you've been through it, along the way. And I think that's, again, not to sort of forestall one of your questions, but for me, that's what the symphony's about. To go through all these different kind of feelings and emotions, and hopefully not to leave people, as in the Tchaikovsky Pathetique Symphony, not feeling very happy at the end of it.
Your first symphony was commissioned by our mutual friend David Lockington in the early 2000s. Up to that point, had writing symphonies been an ambition for you? Is this a genre you always wanted to tackle, or was it sort of the accident of David's commission that set you on this road?
I think, again, referring to that early piece, the Symphonic Music for Strings and Brass, a colleague and friend of ours, the terrific British composer David Matthews, actually wrote that he thought that my Symphonic Music for Strings and Brass was a symphony in all but name. And it was only because at the time I was writing it that I daren't call it a symphony, because that sort of thing was so out of fashion. And I think I've always thought in those sort of terms. Very generally, you can call it developmental. So music that isn't particularly programmatic, isn't particularly rhapsodic, but music which kind of gets somewhere, hopefully, along the way, it develops, journeys along.
You mentioned something in passing, which I think merits a little bit more discussion, this idea that you couldn't call a piece a symphony at a certain point in relatively recent musical history. Tell the audience just a little bit about the gestation of the symphonic music for brass and strings, when you wrote it, what was going on at the time in the musical establishment, and how people reacted to that musical language then.
It actually was quite a depressing time for composers who were basically tonal. And I don't mean tonal in a strict diatonic way, but a lot of people who were around. There was a chap who taught at the Guildhall School of Music when I was there, Edmund Rugger, who's a well-known British symphonist, who'd been taken on by the BBC and played, and his music enjoyed. But then there was this sort of complete change of fashion, if you like, and when Stockhausen, Boulez, these people sort of became the fashion, I suppose even public who perhaps didn't like what they were hearing were just told, no, this is the music of the day and this is what we're going to have. So we were kind of, those of us who still believed in writing pictures that we could actually hear, whether they were right or wrong, we were marginalised. And if somebody actually kind of enjoyed something or spotted a tune, that was really verboten. It seems strange now to look back on how severe and how kind of all-embracing this change of fashion was.
Indeed, and it's. I think people are still sort of unwinding from that point in a way. You in the late 70s get the emergence of minimalism, which is sort of the antithesis of that, but in its own way, just as far from, I think, your musical world as Stockhausen and Boulez, in the sense that you're talking then still about a musical language that's largely not developmental, largely not symphonic, it's based on repetition. It doesn't have that kind of hierarchy of tonal regions that we associate with music in the symphonic tradition. And it's only really more recently, I think, that that kind of symphonic stuff has become not just something that you're writing, but that many composers are. Are there any particular composers in or near your generation who you found inspirational in terms of, going their own way during these years?
Well, I've already mentioned David Matthews, and I think if it weren't for him and his brother Colin, there's Adrian Williams, the, well, I think the composer who crossed a lot of genres, Richard Rodney Bennett, was a great influence, and these people kind of stuck to their guns, whatever anybody said. But of course, they weren't always broadcast or commissioned or recorded because, fashion dictated otherwise. I just think it's a shame that there had to be that period where certain things got excluded, because nothing should be excluded. Everybody should have a chance to express themselves in their own way. I think the other offshoot of it was that a lot of student composers stopped being authentic because they were looking over their shoulders, as indeed was I at a certain point, because you thought, gosh, if I write this, what's everyone going to say? This is a bit naughty, and I think Richard Rodney Bennett particularly taught in the States for a while, and he particularly was upset at the kind of grey, characterless 12-tone music that most of his students were encouraged to write at the time. Of course, one shouldn't be discouraged in writing 12-tone music, but you should be allowed to write any sort of music, and if it's authentic, and as it is with people. Sadly, we see this with politicians. It would be lovely to have authentic politicians. When somebody says actually what they mean, they really mean it, people will believe them and trust them. And I think it's the same with music. It's a vast kind of subject, but I think, we're in a much happier place today now. Ironically, you mentioned minimalism. It's fascinating to me that the minimalists were embraced, loved, quite rightly so, fantastic new movement, and they weren't criticised for using common chords. Yet somebody in the sort of discipline I was, if I used a common chord, I was criticised for it. You can't do that. I just find that so extraordinary that these two, these critics never saw the irony or the kind of contradiction in what they were saying.
So a little over 30 years, I think, separate the symphonic music for strings and brass from the first symphony, if I'm right. Tell us a little bit about the first symphony from a musical point of view, and how you approached that work and what your goals were with it.
Well, first of all, I had the luxury of writing for a very large orchestra, and David, who had premiered the symphonic music of strings and brass, he absolutely trusted me to come up with something for their 75th anniversary, and I wanted to write a big 4-movement symphony in a kind of fairly traditional mould, and I wanted to write an adagio that was kind of like a Brucknerian, Mahlerian adagio, and a fast sort of manic scherzo, and then a finale that had a chorale in it at the end, rather like Brahms 1, or in fact the Mahler that you were going to do. Mm-hmm. So they were my aims. Also, to use this kind of my own version of 12-tone composition in a kind of sort of tonal jacket, if you like, to 12-tone themes and 12-tone harmonies, but not be strictly serial, because I thought it was something that could be done, and that was one of my aims in that piece.
I mean, it's amazing how many composers of the generation or two after Schoenberg were obsessed with avoiding the traps of any kind of tonal reference in 12-tone music. It's like, oh no, there's a third there. You've got to change that. Whereas Berg was already working some tonal references into his use of 12-tone technique, and you write a lot of 12-tone themes, and it seems like you almost do the opposite. You look for an ordering of pitches which sort of tells a story and elicits a sort of harmonic reference point. Talk a little bit about, for instance, the theme that opens the third symphony, because I think that's a really fascinating one.
Yes, well, that was interesting that dear David Matthews actually did an analysis of it in some writing he was doing, and it's always, I mean, it's flattering that people of his stature take the time and trouble to do it. It's fascinating to see what you've come up with that you haven't actually intellectually come up with in a sort of musicianly emotional way. And it seemed that the first part of the tone row was a kind of G minor-ish kind of thing, and then the second half of the tone row was sort of G major-ish. Now, that, as you know, when you see it, you can understand, why that happens. And then, of course, there was that Rogue A flat that I so enjoyed playing with, because I love playing with semitones. And interesting, you're saying about writing a row that has kind of direction. I think intervals, recognizable, pure intervals, fourths or fifths, followed by semitones. Semitones always seem to want to pull one way or the other. And I think if you include that kind of natural pull where they want to go, if your B flat really is a B flat, it wants to pull down to A, or if your B flat is actually an A sharp and wants to push up to a B natural. If you can kind of achieve that, then you get these kind of sinuous melodies, which, as you say, have their own kind of logic and want to move forward. They don't just sound like, oh, but we had all 12 semitones. I hadn't noticed.
I mean, what you've just described there is, very much what would have been verboten in the 1960s, this idea of notes that want to move in a certain direction, that the ear expects to move in a certain direction. I mean, that is and was very controversial for a long time, which is it's very strange, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was also really influenced by Hindemith, because Hindemith was able to write in a tonal way, but kind of reinventing tonality for himself. And these kind of tonal areas where he just kind of moves, there's a semitone shift with all these beautiful chords that are combinations of fourths and fifths. Always, I think it just fascinated me. I mean, Richard Rodney Bennett did it. And actually, if you think of the Bartok dance suite, there's an amazing, I can't remember which of the movements it is, but the divided strings are all in fourths and fifths, and then they suddenly shift up a semitone or down a semitone. And it's like a shaft of light or a curtain being drawn or whatever you like. There's this wonderful, and it's just as effective as, say, in classical terms, a composer moving into the dominant as expected for the second subject in a sonata movement. It's almost like finding equivalents for these things. And actually, getting back to the first symphony, I was desperate to find what I call substitute chords, which is not in the traditional sense that, chord 3 substitutes for chord 5 or whatever. But if there's a dominant seventh, if you can produce a chord that has the same effect as a dominant seventh, but isn't, i.e. leads to some kind of tonic, I found that, really fascinating to do. And obviously there are lots of composers, who've done that. I mean, the augmented sixth chord is kind of, for the classical composers to sort of, move one way, or even the diminished seventh, where you don't know where it's going. But to make something much more complex than that, but still, otherwise, how are you going to heighten the tension and have any sense of expectation or arrival if you don't have the kind of gestural equivalence of what human beings kind of demand? And I mean, everybody likes, in any art form, a bit of excitement, a bit of expectation, a bit of reflection, a bit of sadness, the whole gamut. And the problem with pure series was that it just came out, everything sounded a bit like a horror film.
Tell us a little bit about your second symphony, which is a very different structure, and your only first one movement symphony to date.
That was written for my late conductor friend Robert Shorey, who was a real sort of dynamo, and he commissioned this for the Sydenham Festival. And originally he wanted a celebratory sort of overture, so I'd started it. And when I showed him the first bit of it, he said, no, Phil, this is your second symphony. And, you know, he recognized, as you've recognized, this kind of symphonic principle, whatever that is, maybe we discussed that a bit, that was already inherent in the piece. But I think I was really enthralled to the Schoenberg First Chamber Symphony, which is, Sibelius 7 is another one movement pieces. And it just sort of, I don't know, it was a very happy experience because it was one of these things that almost wrote itself, which I don't know if there are any, you know, composers in the room at the moment, but it's lovely when that happens, isn't it?
Yes.
There aren't those awful moments where you stare at the manuscript paper and think, oh, I'm going to make another cup of coffee, that's something will happen when I come back.
I see some of your colleagues nodding in the audience. I think we all know that feeling. And in a way, I think that was the first symphony of yours that I conducted, and it was just a thrilling discovery. And to see the reaction of Orchestra the Swan when we did it with them was wonderful too, because they absolutely loved playing it. And I suppose the two things that strike me in addition to the one movement form is that it seems like you've come a long way towards integrating all the material. So even though there are elements of a sort of slow movement section and a scherzo section and a finale that brings things together, it all sort of emerges from the same bits of stuff, and it's also much more contrapuntal work. And you know, if tonality was controversial 30 years ago, counterpoint was probably even more so. Talk a little bit about how contrapuntal technique has, you know, become an important part of your language.
I think partly influenced by, obviously, you know, Bach, contrapuntal composer, because one forgets the amazing kind of counterpoint, you know, in Mozart, think of, you know, finale of the 41st Symphony. There's some amazing counterpoint in the Mahler that you're doing. It's sort of, to think of counterpoint as just something which belonged to the Baroque. But I think it's for a long time, historically, you know, the Baroque was the horizontal harmonies, and then we're into the classical period and everything becomes verticalized. But not absolutely. I mean, it's a big generalization. But I just think the use of motif sorry, I'm going to digress very slightly. I think it was my experience also of playing in the Royal Opera House Orchestra, playing a lot of Wagner, or a lot of other composers, obviously, but thinking of how Wagner uses leitmotifs, but not in the obvious way. If you're sitting in the orchestra, you suddenly realize what some string players just say, a bit of scrubbing, that actually the notes that were given partly derived from one of the leitmotifs, so that everything was integrated in the most staggering way. I'm absolutely staggered by the way Wagner did that. And I suppose I'd always thought more harmonically than, you know, melodically or rhythmically, but the kind of refinding almost of working contrapuntally was definitely a lot of freedom. I also think it helped that at the time at Blackheath Conservatoire, I was the person in charge of teaching Bach counterpoint and four-part chorale writing, and I became quite obsessed with that for a while, and I suppose rediscovered just how staggering Bach was, because I mean, as we all know, you can get some contrapuntal lines going along where there are the most extraordinary clashes, and students say, well, look, I look at this chord and I can't analyse it because they're looking at it this way. And of course, the whole beauty of counterpoint is it works horizontally. And does give you a lot of freedom. I know some people have said, oh yes, but if you're writing atonal counterpoint, it doesn't really matter what notes you use. But I completely refute that, because you can hear when something just sounds like a sort of, cut and paste job. But certainly it kind of reinvigorated my style, I think, and helped move my style on.
Let's talk a little bit about your view of the symphony. What makes a symphony to you, and what is the importance of a symphony as an artistic statement?
I think you can almost sum it up in one word, and that word is becoming. So it's something which happens, something, you're not there at the start, you're not there at the middle, but hopefully you're there at the end. So that this kind of journey is a journey of some sort of completion. And it's growth, its development of ideas, and this idea of what something becomes eventually as the kind of accumulative effect of things. And it also happens between movements. I mean, it's not just something which happens in a single movement. I think if movements don't naturally suit a symphony, I mean, you know more about this than I do, but I mean, wasn't there a movement in Mahler 1 that we took out? There were going to be 5 movements, weren't there, or something?
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, so that's always kind of an interesting way of looking at what kind of movements will suit and what work. Although, isn't it extraordinary that Bruckner 9, missing movements because it's incomplete, seems to work amazingly well. One can only wonder what it might have been like, had it been completed.
Well, and interestingly, your 4th symphony, you didn't set out to write a 3-movement work, did you? That decision came really when you finished the 3rd movement, didn't it?
Yes. It's interesting that, you kind of have an idea of the overall structure of something, probably before you start. I mean, Malcolm Arnold was supposed to be rather like Mozart, in that he kind of had a whole vision of what he was going to write in his head before he even started. But for me, I had thought that my 4th symphony was going to be a 4-movement work, but the final adagio just became so enormous and so kind of just was obvious that finished the piece, and to actually write any more would have been a bit of an anticlimax. It would have been inappropriate, I mean, I think people would have just said, well, what on earth is he stuck another movement on for? It should have stopped there.
One thing we see in Mahler's music is this interconnectivity between the symphonies themselves. So, for instance, the famous trumpet theme that opens the 5th Symphony has previously appeared in the 1st movement of his 4th Symphony, and there's quotes from Kindertotenlieder in the 5th Symphony. There's a quote from the 4th Symphony, 2nd movement, the Devil with the Fiddle bit. There's a quote from one of the Wunderhorn songs in the last movement. But there's also all these things that are not even quotes from particular pieces, but just sort of Mahlerisms, the way he uses perfect fourths melodically, which, you can see these patterns in every single one of his symphonies, even as his overall language emerges and evolves a lot. And I mean, interesting, this is what I find a lot in your music too. David Lockington and I were talking yesterday about Philipisms and, some of these ideas that come back from piece to piece. And I'm just curious, when you're at the desk, are you consciously aware that, okay, this is the octave theme from the Kandinsky reappearing in the violin concerto, or is it all much more just sort of your language, and it comes out as it does?
I think it is probably the language, although I notice in this new symphony that this little figure which crops up, the slow movement that crops up in the last movement, I noticed it actually was in the octet that your chamber group performed at Northern Priory, about last month. I noticed even those same 4 notes are in there. They of course sound completely different in the context. I don't consciously do it. I used to just consciously take a little snippet from a previous work and include it in the beginning of the next work. For example, the end of the first symphony, I included some of the chords at the start of Gale of Life, concert overture. That was a deliberate borrowing. So I have occasionally done that. And I've sometimes buried things in inner parts just to see if, 200 years later, if any of it ever survives, some clever so-and-so will say, oh gosh, look at that in the cello part. That's the same as the flute part in the blah, blah, blah. But I think you're right. It's more to do with language. After all, when you think of how many times did Mahler use dotted rhythms, or you think of, in the Ninth Symphony, ba 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 bum, ba ba. That's the sort of gesture that could have occurred in any of the symphonies. And yeah, I'm a great believer in people having their own language, and that's something that I'm amazed that people do actually recognise that, in my stuff, because I think that kind of, I think that just shows authenticity. That I'm not trying to write what people want necessarily, because that may not always be what I feel, and to go against what you feel in your natural instincts, you're going to come up with something that is just not convincing.
Sometimes there's an unlikely impetus that helps dictate the character of a musical work. And you mentioned to me in passing that the introduction of the harp in the Fifth Symphony had a lot to do with how you used the whole orchestra. Tell us a little bit about why you added the harp and how it might have made the symphony have a slightly different atmosphere to it than your earlier works.
It's only the second time that I've written for the harp. I wrote a harp part for the Kandinsky symphonic poem. And I've often felt when I've listened to a lot of music that you often can't hear the harp. I mean, you think of these great tuttis in music where you've got pairs of harps and you can see them doing this, they're absolutely like mad, and the whole orchestra is steaming away fortissimo. And it may add to the texture in some subtle way, but I wanted to use the harp, melodically, as well as, I didn't want it to be just like a kind of substitute piano part with just arpeggios running all over the place. And I think it adds a certain delicacy, but it also influenced the woodwind writing, strangely enough. I just found out I was kind of handling things slightly differently. And I rather like the way that, I hope it works, but obviously I haven't heard it yet, but the way the harp sort of has the last say at the end of the symphony, in a very quiet, unassuming way, and sort of poses a question, that little nagging G flat, which came from the first movement. So we've had a glorious, resounding B flat major, and there's this little kind of hint that it wasn't that long ago that we had a rather gloomy B flat minor. Although, it sort of disappears. It's just like, a little wisp of wind or an afterthought, perhaps a little bit of reminiscing.
I found myself saying to our harpist, Catherine, at the first rehearsal that in a lot of ways, she's kind of the protagonist of the work. I mean, she's always there at key structural moments, and in a way, that sort of sense of the final say she has in many key places in the symphony, or initiating new sections of the work. Well, I'm gutted that you can't hear it tonight, but we'll get you a recording soon. It's very good. You'll like it. I'm going to suggest that now we focus on two things. We'll take a few questions from the audience, and then at the end, we're going to play a short excerpt from Philip's Fourth Symphony. We'll play the end of the Fourth Symphony just to give folks a sense of what, a typical Sawyers-esque experience is. But first, let's see if we've got any questions from the audience.
Mr. Sawyers, you've alluded a couple of times that you've not heard this work, that Kenneth probably knows more about it than you do in that regard. In general, when you compose a piece and didn't hear it, does it come out like you expected? Does it come out different? Are you kind of surprised or pleased?
Could you hear that, Philip?
Oh, no, I couldn't really, sorry.
No, the question is, when you've written a piece and then you hear it for the first time, does that often surprise you? Do you wonder what it's going to sound like before it's played, and what is the usual reaction to hearing the performance?
I think it's the same as listening to recorded music and hearing live concerts. So far, I've always been pleasantly surprised. I think the colour and the vigour and the energy of performers, what they bring to it, and the interpretation that players bring to it, give it a kind of extra energy that somehow I might not have fully realised. I suppose it's a little bit like if you've written a poem and one person reads exactly the same words and then another person reads them and puts perhaps a little more interpretation into it, how it can lift it. The other thing is I'm always really wary that my orchestration works. That's a thing that I hope there won't be any nasty shocks, that I haven't made a terrible miscalculation. In fact, can I just very briefly tell you, I've just been rereading some Gordon Jacob books about orchestration, and there's one illustration, 3 trombones, very low, and it's from a Berlioz Grand Messe Nord, and 3 flutes, the same triad, about 5 octaves higher. And Gordon Jacob, in wonderful dry English, says, looking at this orchestration on paper, one might think that it sounds rather unpleasant. Then he says the present author has heard it and can confirm it is. So I just hope there weren't any miscalculations in the orchestration. But generally, I am pleased. But I think it's because of the vibrancy that a live performance brings to it.
I mean, I can speak from experience that, many times Philip has given me a new piece and said, oh, I think I might have messed this one up. I remember this with the violin concerto and the Fourth Symphony, that there was a certain amount of like, oh gosh, well, sorry to let the team down. And then actually hearing the orchestra play it, I think you were enormously relieved. We had a terrible mishap with the violin concerto. We were supposed to premiere it with an orchestra in Guildford with wonderful violinist Alexander Sitkovetsky, who ended up recording it with us later. But on the day of the concert, he fell incredibly ill. And so we had to cancel the piece and replace it with a Mozart symphony. But Philip was already there for the rehearsal. So we took just enough time to play a few of the orchestral bits, which Philip had never heard. And I think, that was a great relief, even just to hear the opening. with the orchestra.
Yeah, yes, it was. Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? You know, I think it may just be in my character to be naturally sort of diffident anyway. And I think it's very un-English. Sorry to kind of mix metaphors, but to blow your own trumpet.
I think it might be of interest to some of our listeners. Your actual method of composing, are you a, pick out notes in Sibelius kind of guy? Are you a sit down at the piano and improvise kind of guy? What's actually happening when you're writing a piece of music?
Well, I've already sort of opened this little book, but it all sort of looks, it all happens like this. There are just pages and pages of this kind of scribble, and as ideas come into my head, I write on paper, and I find if I can work directly on Sibelius, but I think if I haven't got enough down on paper first and thought it through, then it becomes a waste of time. So I'm definitely an in the head first, paper second, instrument or Sibelius third.
Very good. Other questions? Kelly.
Just wondering, I was doing a little bit of research to try to figure out if there's any way to get access to your scores, and the only thing I found that have been published were the 2 violin sonatas. Have your larger works been published for general access to people other than conductors?
Kelly's asking if your works have been published and where they would be available.
No, they're well, I was almost going to be published by Breitkopf and Harburg, and then COVID came along.
Oh. There you go.
So, no, funnily enough, a violinist friend of mine who was friends with the lady who was head of Faber said, "Oh, they'd love to publish you," and I think she heard perhaps the first 10 seconds of the Gale of Life overture and said, "No, he's a film composer, we don't want to publish him." At the end of that. But I think a lot of people self-publish, because you've got the control over it. It is possible. And quite honestly, there are so many composers. So the music, is always available from me or from Ken. In fact, Ken is almost, I think your house in Wales has become sort of lively.
That may well be true, but that's a role I'm very proud and pleased to carry. But yeah, it is all available through Philip's website, and the Breitkopf folks are hopeful that they'll be able to pick things up. But it as bad as COVID has been for orchestras and festivals, it's been even worse for publishers. They've just been strangled the last couple of years. One last question before I play the Fourth Symphony, if anyone. Great. So I'll play. This is just a little clip from the recording sessions of Philip's Fourth Symphony. We were very lucky that a slot opened up with the BBC National Orchestra of Wales to do it on very short notice. And in the end, this ended up being about 5 or 6 weeks before everything shut down. So we got it in just in the nick of time. The piece still hasn't been performed in a concert, but it was wonderful to see the orchestra respond to it. So I'm going to play the last 5 movements of the Fourth Symphony. And just to give you an idea of where we are in the journey of the piece, the first movement is very tragic and stormy. The second movement is a very fast, wild scherzo. And then the third movement is a long adagio, kind of a funeral march. It quotes the funeral march from Beethoven's Third Symphony over and over and over again. And so we're going to pick it up here about 2/3 of the way in. So we've had a lot of darkness and a lot of drama thus far in the piece. And now we sort of come to the, if you like, the beginning of the end of the work. And this is how we'll finish off to YouTube so that we can watch this. And I'm going to leave Philip on Zoom, but so he can hear it. Although I think he knows how it goes by now. And hopefully the technology will cooperate with us. Oh no, you
Did you
don't.
change your mirror in the? There you go.
There you go, you got it.
There we go. All righty. Ready? Yes. We'll shut down. We'll switch over. 5 minutes. Well, I think we've got to give Philip a big round of applause. What a piece, Philip. And the fit.
What a great day that was. Well, a great couple of days with you and the Welsh Orchestra. I feel, really honoured. And, hearing that, I know that the Fifth Symphony, I couldn't be there to be at rehearsals, to say anything, but I think, as I said in the email, I trust you more than I trust myself with it. So, have a wonderful concert tonight and really enjoy the Mahler as well. A fantastic symphony. And thank you for everybody who's come, to join in. Terrific.
Thank you, Philip. So we'll take a little 10-minute leg stretch and then reconvene, and I'll talk a little bit about Mahler 5, if that's all right with everyone. Thank you very much.
We've got some water here if you want to pitch
Great
some
job,
water
Philip.
glasses as well.
Okay, Ben.
Restroom straight to the
Great to
back.
see you. And, oh, it's really good. You'll love it. Great. All right, I'll let you get going, and I'll keep you posted. Cheers.
Fantastic.
How are you?
You guys are incredible. Really. I mean, I just